What do you like? Tell me what you like.
I love the idea of nourishing both our body and our soul.
Welcome to the Nourishing You Podcast, presented by the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, NANP. We invite you to join Kristen Burkett and Diana Wally as they host experts from the holistic wellness space who will share practical tips and information to enhance your health and vitality. Kristen and Diana are master nutrition therapists and board certified in holistic nutrition, with private practices that support their clients as they strive to reach their full potential. If you enjoy today's show, please help us out by commenting below, liking this video, and subscribing to the channel to help us spread the word.
You have to move your body. That's my message. That's my passion.
Thank you for your interest in our content. This meeting and all materials presented today, including slides, audio, video, and chat content, are protected intellectual property of the hosting organization, the National Association of Nutrition Professionals, NANP. Recording, screen capturing, rebroadcasting, transcribing, or otherwise using any portion of this presentation is strictly prohibited without prior written permission. This includes the use of third-party platforms such as Webinar TV, as well as AI chatbots, AI note-taking tools, or any other artificial intelligence technologies. Unauthorized use of this content may result in immediate removal from the meeting and may subject the offending party to legal action. By remaining in this session, you acknowledge and agree to these terms. Thank you for your cooperation, and we appreciate your respect for our work. This episode of the Nourishing You Podcast is brought to you by MaxGen Labs.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this episode of the Nourishing You Podcast. It's a pleasure to have Josh Gitalis with us today to understand the nitty-gritty of fasting. Josh has always been fascinated with the fields of health and the human body. He began studies in these areas at the University of Western Ontario, receiving an honors degree in kinesiology. Josh then began working as a fitness coach, qualifying as a certified strength and conditioning specialist, helping clients reach their physical goals. Over time, Josh realized that a key to reaching optimal physical strength included key therapeutic nutrition and became a certified nutritional practitioner. Josh runs a Toronto-based private practice with a worldwide client base. He's a recognized leader in his field, and Josh teaches clinical nutrition for several natural health colleges and is the first Canadian nutritionist to be accepted into the Institute for Functional Medicine, where he's currently pursuing his certification as an Institute of Functional Medicine certified practitioner. Thanks for being with us today, Josh.
Thank you for having me. And just to update you a little bit, I think that might be an old bio because I was certified back in 2016 by the Institute for Functional Medicine. So,
wow. Okay. Well, congratulations, and you've been doing this for a long time.
So it's been about 10 years.
Okay. All right. Well, I guess we need to get our information updated, but we're so glad to have you, and now we'll get to listen to your expertise as being that.
Yeah, it's all good.
Josh, real quick, are you still, as your outdated bio said, still the first in your area of specialty that is certified by IFM, or are there other people now?
Well, I'll always be the first, no matter when we're chatting. Yes, I was the first when I did get certified in 2016. Okay. And I think others have come along the way afterwards. But that's
super impressive. That's really impressive.
Yeah, it was a great program, and I learned a ton, and extremely helpful in my clinical practice as well.
Excellent. Well, this leads into our first question. We're obviously so happy you're here. We love connecting with our favorite Canadian friends. And so before we dive in, we do want our listeners to get to know you a little bit better. And we'd love to know your story, how you found your way into the holistic and functional nutrition world. And specifically, are there experiences or aspects of health you were curious about that really pulled you in?
Yeah, so as Kristen mentioned, I did do kinesiology in university, which I loved, but there was nothing I really wanted to go into from that. I always had a wide array of interests, and nothing really encapsulated it all. Like everything was a specialty, right? You can go into orthopedics, you could go into physiotherapy, you could do kinesiology. And I knew there was something out there that had everything. I just hadn't found it yet. I took a little bit of time off after university, went to go play in the mountains for a bit, skiing and mountain biking and having fun. And then after a year of that, I realized I needed to kind of come back and figure out what I wanted to do with that. I became a strength and conditioning coach, as you mentioned, and didn't really enjoy that too much because most people were just interested in working out rather than working in. And I started nutrition school, and everything changed when I started nutrition school. I'm like, this is what I've been looking for my whole life, because you had to understand every system of the body. You had to understand how they interacted, and you had to understand how to bring them back into balance when they were out of balance. And I love that. It was true health. It was what I knew I would devote the rest of my life to up to this point, I guess. So that's how I began. And then right out of school, I started practicing clinically, one-on-one with people, and I haven't looked back.
Wonderful. That really resonates with me. I mean, it's kind of the same thing. It's like once you open the door to seeing the systems connections and how everything has to balance together, it's kind of hard to unknow what you started to see and peek into, and it's just fascinating. Well, we're glad to have you in this field for sure. So we have talked a lot about different nutrition approaches on this podcast over the years, and we've even done a deeper dive into intermittent fasting, but we realized we've never really unpacked fasting itself in a more complete way. So to start us off, can you just help everyone understand what is fasting really? And then maybe give us a brief perspective on the history of fasting and how our modern eating patterns might differ from what humans have experienced.
For sure. Well, I think just at a basic, very, very basic level, fasting is when you're not eating. So we're all fasting right now because we're doing this interview. But then we can start to understand the different nuance associated with fasting, the different time frames that we can fast and what that does for the human body and what that means in terms of the physiological ramifications. And there's so many different iterations out there. And really, as you know, there's no right one way for everyone. But if we understand some of the mechanisms and concepts behind the different types of fasting and what they have to offer, we can learn how to incorporate that into our life and reap the benefits of fasting for ourselves. Our brains are in the present, but our genes are in the past. We come from ancestors that lived in an extremely different way than we do today. And part of that way of living was this flip-flop of being in the fed state and the fasting state, and it was much more extreme than it is today. Usually people are eating 3 meals a day. They're in the fed state most of the time. Oh, I feel a little bit of hunger. I'm going to go get a snack or have a meal, right? The hunger is that signal that, I got to fill up again. I shouldn't feel that feeling. Way back in the day, though, we didn't have these buildings on every corner stocked with food. We had to find our own food. I'm watching this show called Alone. Have you heard of the show Alone?
Yes.
It's amazing. So they send these people out into the wilderness, and they're living completely by themselves, and they have a bunch of camera equipment, and they have to film everything. And basically the last person to not tap out is the one that wins the show. But one of their biggest challenges is finding food and a way to eat. And there's a lot of big spans of what we could call starvation or fasting. And this is what we were accustomed to way back in the day. And in that phase, a whole bunch of different mechanisms turn on that we can take advantage of today if we start to tap into some of the benefits of the fasting. We also know that, fasting has been a part of a lot of cultures and a lot of religions over the years. I come from a Jewish background, so we have a couple holidays, like one of them is Yom Kippur, where you fast for a day, and it's part of that tradition that and the spiritual experience of fasting, which I would say there's definitely an aspect of that has been practiced all over the world for hundreds, if not thousands of years.
It is interesting, that point that you bring up, that many religions do have a fasting component. It's part of their spirituality. I think that's so interesting.
Yeah, and it begs the question, like, why, right? Why are people choosing to refrain from eating food? And if you've ever experienced the effects of fasting, you know that it challenges, at one level, it challenges you in a way where you're not eating. So you actually experience hunger. I think that's a good thing, a feeling of restriction. And also, when we start to dive into the actual mechanisms at play, where you're depleting your glycogen, you're not using sugar as your primary fuel, and you're starting to use fats as energy and eventually ketones, that is actually the primary fuel for the brain. And when we provide the brain with such a high octane, amazing fuel, it works better. And you think better, your cognition's better. And maybe traditionally they compared that to more of a spiritual experience where you can get your brain in a different state of mind than it usually is.
That would make sense for sure.
Mm-hmm.
You know, when people hear the word fasting, they often picture one extreme. But can you kind of walk us through the different types of fasting and how they may have different effects in the body?
Absolutely. I think what most people can really benefit from, which is a low-hanging fruit, and what most people are probably doing anyway, is some sort of, intermittent fasting or time-restricted eating, where they're eating within a certain window and they're not eating in another window. And obviously the easiest window not to eat is when you're asleep. So if we're sleeping about, 8 hours or so per night on average, we can get a really good chunk of fasting in if we don't eat after dinner, and then we have breakfast at whatever time, maybe push it a little bit. So say you have dinner at 6 p.m. and you stop eating at 7 p.m. At 7 a.m., you've already fasted 12 hours. If you push that to like 9 a.m., you get a good 14-hour fast. And that's a really good baseline for fasting. And there's a lot of benefits we actually see from that metabolically. There's a lot of rejuvenation of our cells that happen overnight. And when you lengthen that fasting period, you can get some more of those benefits. So, that's sort of, I would say, the bare minimum when it comes to fasting. And then as you extend that, you can start to skip breakfast. So you're having lunch and dinner. And a lot of this is going to change depending on what your goals are, who you are, and what your metabolism is like. And we can talk about some of those nuances as well. And then you're extending kind of some of the benefits of the overnight fast. Once you hit 24 hours and longer, now you might start to get into a state of ketosis, where you've used up your glycogen stores. So we have about 400 grams of storage in the muscle of glycogen, and we have about 100 to 120 grams of storage in the liver. And that equates to about 2,000 calories. So if we use up that, which takes about, if you think a day, that's typically kind of what people consume in a day. So if you use it up throughout a day, about 24 hours, then you need to find other energy sources within, and your body starts to take fat, which we have an amazing storage, vessel of fat in our body. And it starts to make energy from the fat, from the fatty acids, from the triglycerides, 3 fats, glycerol backbone, breaks those off, uses those as energy, and that energy currency is known as ketones. And then ketones are really cool energy substances because they're not just for energy, like glycogen is just for energy, but they also have signaling properties as well. They're called signaling molecules. So not only do they provide energy to our cells, but they also do a whole bunch of other special, cool little things like increase mitochondrial production and efficiency, increase brain regeneration, like it increases hormones like BDNF in the brain, It helps just metabolically work more, the metabolism work way more efficiently. So it's really cool. And then, once you get into even the 3 to 5 day mark, you can actually start producing more stem cells. And stem cells are they're the building blocks for every single cell in our body, right? Every cell is going to differentiate from a stem cell. There's a lot of stem cell therapies out there actually right now, like trying to capitalize on that. But this is the internal mechanism within our body that does it for us. But you have to get to that 3 to 5 day mark. And amazing regeneration can happen. Like a lot of the work, Walter Longo, if you're familiar with him, he's done a lot of work with fasting. And he, in one study particularly, they used mouse models that had MS, and they gave them his fasting mimicking diet, which I can talk about if you want, the ketogenic diet, and then just like a control. And those mice on the fasting mimicking diet actually had regeneration and nerve growth. You can see it in the pictures of the study. It's fascinating. And they did another study on type 1 diabetes, and they had regeneration of the beta cells. So it's quite fascinating and impressive what you can do when you're using some of these disciplines to help restore certain systems.
So that was a great foundation. Thank you for that. One of the best I've heard. And, you mentioned that there is some nuance around maybe who might choose fasting, maybe why you did get into some of the benefits of fasting. So I'd love to get into some of that nuance as far as who might choose it and why. And then we definitely want to talk about boundaries. So maybe when it wouldn't be safe. So a couple of those questions.
Yeah. I think we could do the wouldn't be safe first, just to get that out of the way.
Okay.
Some of them are kind of obvious, but I think they should be mentioned anyway. If someone has an eating disorder, I think this is territory where you want to tread very lightly. If someone's anorexic, obviously we don't want to go into fasting because they need extra weight. Pregnancy, I would definitely stay away from that, and lactation, I'd stay away from that as well. And then, of course, there's a lot of different conditions and diseases that people might have already been diagnosed with, where they would want to check to see if this is safe for their specific illness or if they're on certain medications. Because sometimes medications need food, sometimes there's food interactions. So we want to proceed with caution if you're not in good health, as we would say it. But assuming you're in good health and you're starting out with a relatively clean bill of health, I think everyone can benefit in some way. Sometimes you need to go slower, sometimes you could go a little bit more aggressive. So when people have not had any experience with fasting, it's good to just proceed with caution, just go slowly, because you want to find something that works for you. And if it's so uncomfortable for you that you never want to do it again, you've lost out on something that could be so helpful for you. So I think that doing that overnight fast and then trying to push it and push it and push it is one of the best, easiest ways to start to experiment and see how you feel fasted. Then what I do with my clients when they're pretty good with that is we do a 1-day, 24-hour fast. So we fast from dinner to dinner is usually the easiest, and see how that goes. Now, the cool thing is, if you're starting to do that and you feel like so bad on the fasted day, just eat food again and just bail on it and then give it a try another time. But the 24-hour fast is something I do often with people. And then in certain situations, we start to dive into some longer fasts. We've also done fasting to accompany certain therapies, so like chemotherapy and radiation. There's an amazing body of research at this point now that when you go into that in a fasted state and then try to maintain the fasted state a little bit afterwards, it makes the cancer cells more vulnerable to your immune system, and it protects your cells much better than if you weren't in a fasted state from the radiation from the chemotherapy. So I've used it with clients that are going through cancer treatment as a helpful way for them to tolerate the therapy a lot better.
So how long, like in general, could someone fast safely?
Great question. Well, the world record for fasting was by this gentleman by the name of Angus. I think it was in the...
Yeah, Chris, sorry to interrupt you, but Kristen and I have talked about this. I'm so glad you brought this up because I want our listeners to hear the story.
I think it was in the UK. This guy was morbidly obese. He was 456 pounds. And he enrolled in a study at the hospital, a supervised study, where they fasted for 14 days. That was the duration of the study. By the end of this study, he felt so good that he continued it on his own. And he fasted for over a year, 382 days.
Wow.
He lost 276 pounds. Now, during that time, he would drink like coffee and tea and some electrolytes, some vitamins, but he stayed away from calories, from anything caloric for that whole time. So when people say, this is really interesting, when they say, I can't do that, no, there's no way I can fast. Really, I can't is I won't with an excuse. We can all fast. We do it between meals. And probably everyone watching this or listening to this right now, if I deprived food and took it away from you, you would survive probably at least a month. No problem. So we can do it. It's just a matter of choosing a way to do it and incorporate it into your life. And so that is quite a span of time, doing it over a year. And obviously he had a lot of spare energy to fuel that fast.
What's the risk of losing lean muscle mass when you fast for extended periods of time?
Another great question. There is definitely a risk. When you work out, when you perform physical activity, you do stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And you can help to keep that muscle. Also, ketones have a muscle sparing effect. So when you're using that as an energy source, you're not breaking down muscle as readily. Now, at a certain point, you will start to break down muscle. If you're doing overnight fasts, no. Although I can talk about that in a moment. There's a couple interesting things we've learned about that. If you're doing 24-hour fasts, totally fine. You can even exercise to help maintain that muscle mass. Even 3 to 5 day fasts, it's all going to come back if you lose a little bit. So I'm not worried for those types of fasts whether you're going to lose too much muscle mass. Yeah.
Talk about what were you just going to say about the overnight fasting? Because that's
what yes.
I'm trying to do.
Yeah. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but one of the populations that can be so vulnerable to losing muscle is the elderly, because as we get older, we're less able to digest protein properly. We're less able to stimulate muscle protein synthesis. And they've done studies where they give, the elderly that might be in hospital for whatever reason, like a really high protein shake right before they go to sleep. And that really helps to preserve muscle protein synthesis overnight. So this is another really great example of where it might not be for everyone. Like that would definitely be someone I would add to the list, the elderly, or someone who's in debility. We actually want to do the opposite. We want to stimulate muscle protein synthesis and growth and repair as much as possible. So we want to hit them with actually pretty high amounts of protein and minimize the fasting window for those types of people.
So how would you know it's for you? Because you mentioned the elderly, and I'm not to speak for you, Kristen, but I think we're on the same page with that because we both see older clients and understand for adequate calories and protein and strength training and all of that. But then you look at that gentleman Angus, who was obese and fasted for over a year and holds the record. So what about somebody that's in between? How do you know it's right for you and isn't going to cause issues? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, you want to keep your eye on a few goals. So one goal would be you need to make sure you're getting your protein needs per day. So I'm not sure if you're aware, but the US just updated their food pyramid and all their recommendations. And one of the things they updated was they're increasing the protein recommendation from 0.8 grams per kilogram to 1.2 to 1.6, which is a lot closer to what people need. So if you're fasting and you're sacrificing some of those protein needs, then you shouldn't be doing it, right? You need to get that dosage in, spaced out as much as possible to improve absorption and utilization on a daily basis. And if you're doing that, then you can experiment with a little bit of fasting. Yeah. But of course, if you're doing the 24-hour fast, you're just not eating anything for the 24 hours, but you can build back up after. It's fine that happens. And I've been doing a 24-hour fast for 1 day a week for years now. I don't know, maybe like 5 or 6 years. And over that period of time, I mean, that's a pretty good span of time to give it a test. I've gained muscle rather than lost muscle, right? And even though I'm missing, 24 hours or 1 day a week of, 1 day a week of calories. So you can get that back and it doesn't pose any issues for that period of time.
Amazing. I just have one more question. I know we want to move on to a few different things. Just hydration. So you mentioned, back to that gentleman, Angus, the world record holder for fasting. You said that he took vitamins, coffee, tea, lots of hydration, electrolyte. So how important is that when someone's fasting? The hydration piece.
Right. So I think a lot of what we talk about too is the longer you're fasting, the more these things are important, right? So for short term, it's not a big deal. You don't necessarily need electrolytes, but electrolytes can be quite helpful because when we're storing glycogen, we actually hold on to more water too. So we definitely need to make sure we're hydrating well. Electrolytes can be very helpful with some of the symptoms associated with fasting because you could lose extra minerals extra minerals in the fasted state. And one thing that I noticed personally, anecdotal, I know this is N of 1, but I've implemented this with a lot of clients and it's quite helpful, that when you fast for longer periods, like 3 to 5 days, you can get kind of restless muscles, restless legs, agitated, that feeling at night, restless leg syndrome, sometimes people call it. And electrolytes can help greatly with that, or even just some supplementation with minerals like calcium and magnesium. And those are non-caloric, right? Like they're just minerals. So they don't affect the mechanisms that have been turned on that provide all those amazing benefits associated with fasting.
MaxGen Labs is a genetics-based wellness company empowering individuals and practitioners with science-driven insights into nutrition, fitness, and functional health. They offer targeted DNA test panels that deliver clear, actionable reports on methylation, detoxification pathways, nutrient metabolism, and key genetic markers such as MTHFR gene. With a focus on education and precision, MaxGen supports client-centered care and long-term wellness across health disciplines. Whether optimizing outcomes or educating clients, MaxGen Labs is your partner in functional health innovation.
All right, so you've kind of laid the groundwork here for us, and we've talked a little bit about some of the health benefits and some of the specific conditions, but could you go into a little bit more detail from a health perspective, what those potential benefits for that, different people might want to consider and what the body is actually gaining from that fasting? Let's dive into that a little bit deeper.
Yeah, so if we're getting into states where we're getting into ketosis, so that would need to be at least 24 hours for most people. And for someone who's extremely metabolically unhealthy, it may take a little bit longer to get those ketones to be produced properly. Because
talk about that a little bit more. Explain that a little more. And
yes.
Because I know there's a lot of people that, they'll fast or or they have trouble getting into ketosis, or then if they do, they still struggle. So talk a little bit more about that metabolic piece.
Yeah, I think there's a few traps people run into. I can get into a few of those because I've experienced a couple myself. But we're so used to carbohydrates. Like we love them. We love eating them, They're the ones that are easy to get in, right? It's the protein or the fat that's not as easy, and carbs are everywhere. So we definitely, for the most part, most of us are overeating carbs. When we eat too many carbohydrates, we release insulin because insulin is the response to try to get that sugar either into the cell or to store it as glycogen, which will run out of space in glycogen and then store it as fat. So a lot of people are walking around with chronically elevated insulin. Now, as we know, like say this is optimal health or good insulin sensitivity, and this is insulin insensitivity, and this is maybe like type 2 diabetes. There's a lot of in between, right? That, if you go to your doctor and get checked, they're just gonna say, oh, everything's fine. They're waiting for you to get high hemoglobin A1C or high fasting insulin before they say you're a type 2 diabetic and we need to treat it. But a lot of people can have high fasting insulin. And that's actually quite easy to check. You check that in the morning in a fasted state. You do a blood test and you can see that. When insulin is high, it doesn't allow for the production of ketones. It won't let your body transition from using glycogen, because it's still sending that signal saying we got glycogen, we're trying to get that into the cell, to starting to liberate fat to use that as energy. So if we're dealing with someone who has high elevated insulin from eating carbs for many years, too many carbs, once they're in a fasted state, they're going to start breaking down their glycogen in their muscle and their liver, but then their insulin's still going to be high. So they're not going to be able to make the ketones they need to supply the energy that they need. And they're going to feel really crummy. Sometimes that's called the keto flu, when people have trouble transitioning. Now, if you're more metabolically flexible, we haven't said that term yet today, but that's something that tells us you're able to switch from fat to carbs and sometimes protein, but easily back and forth, right? You're like that hunter and gatherer that, oh, we found all this food, we're gonna eat it. Okay, we don't have it now. We're gonna go back in fasted state and we're still gonna feel okay while we look for our next meal. But again, we have so much food available to us. It's always there. We're always, having these calories available, that the metabolic flexibility, that muscle never gets flexed much. Mm-hmm. And those people who haven't flexed it much are going to have trouble transitioning into that phase, which is why previously I said sometimes you have to start slow, or else you're going to feel so crummy that you're just going to bail on the whole fasting experiment. But you have to get that insulin to sort of come down, and that's also going to take time, and you have to get your cells more insulin sensitive so that the insulin can get the energy into the cell. The energy and the blood glucose can decrease, and then the pancreas doesn't make as much insulin, and we can get that going down. And then as soon as that comes down, you'll start making more ketones.
So how does someone begin to work through that process to get to that insulin sensitivity when they're starting at this other level?
Great, yeah. So I think the first step would be to reduce carbohydrates. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So again, we're so used to consuming so much of it, so we just need to start reducing and reducing and reducing and reducing. So what does that look like in the real world, right? Josh is talking about all this biochemistry and everything and all these concepts, but what does it look like when you're sitting with someone or you are someone trying to do that? So I was working with a client just the other day, and he was a 13-year-old with elevated fasting insulin. So we're moving in the wrong direction. And previously, he had elevated liver enzymes and elevated hemoglobin A1C. So this is really early for this to be happening. So we got to start to reduce some carbohydrates. So we were just talking about breakfast. What was for breakfast? 2 eggs, slice of bacon, an apple, and I think it was some juice, right? Or a couple pieces of toast. It wasn't juice, it was a couple pieces of toast. So great, let's work with what we have. Instead of the toast and the apple, let's increase some of the other stuff and maybe replace the toast and the apple with a vegetable. So we're gonna eat, instead of 2 eggs, maybe 3 eggs. Instead of 1 slice of bacon, 2 or 3 slices of bacon. And then we're going to add maybe some, maybe not for a 13-year-old, but for the average person, maybe some sauerkraut or kimchi on eggs. delicious. I love
Fire.
that. Yeah. It goes so well. And then what you've now done, you've taken out everything that's high glycemic index, high glycemic load, and you've replaced that with low glycemic index, low glycemic load foods that are not going to cause an insulin spike. And you've started with that one meal to change your metabolic response to what you're eating. And if we do that with every meal, we'll slowly move in that direction. And then you can start to experiment more with like the fed and fasting state.
Okay, so I've got one more question, and Diana, I feel like I'm taking over here, and I don't mean to. So you mentioned keto flu that people or sometimes experience. Most of the time, I hear conversations around that's because it's a sodium issue, and it's not related to this metabolic flexibility. So can you comment on that at all?
Well, I think it's both happening at the same time, where as you're moving into more of a ketogenic state, you're also losing more minerals through your urine. So that's why before, as we were discussing, that the electrolytes could be really helpful for that.
Okay.
Well, I think we have some really fun practical questions that I'm excited to get into, maybe slightly controversial. The first one is, I work primarily with women in my practice. And so this is something I hear all the time is, does fasting affect women differently than men? Should I not fast because I'm a woman? Should I fast all the time because I'm a woman? So what differences might there be between men and women? Do hormones play a role? And then also, if you wouldn't mind discussing on when we're talking about women, does it differ premenopausal, postmenopausal? So I know that's a lot, but go. What do you got?
There's definitely differences between men and women when it comes to fasting. Now, the first question we have to ask, though, is what is the goal of the individual, right? Because if I'm working with a woman who's overweight and metabolically unhealthy, I'm not as concerned with the nuances of hormones and what that might mean, like if they're still menstruating and what that might mean in relation to the menstrual cycle. We really just need to get them metabolically healthy, and we need to get the weight down. So that's kind of one aspect of it. I know a lot of people are just trying to optimize, and they're thinking, oh, I'm a woman, should I be doing the same thing as a man? And maybe you should be modifying it somewhat. So for women who are currently menstruating, they may want to lay off really fasting during their flow, because that sometimes makes people feel a lot more depleted during that time, and then they can get back into it afterwards. And also just going back to the specificity of the type of fasting, like some people just feel really good doing intermittent fasting. Some people feel good just doing the 24-hour fast one time a week. Or some people even do really well doing a 3 to 5 day fast a few times a year. I mean, that goes back to the work of Dr. Walter Longo, where he's talking about his fasting mimicking diet. And basically, the sicker you are, the more often you need to do it because of that rejuvenation effect. What that dose is, we don't know yet. I don't think that research has been done. Also, I think women typically have a more difficult time liberating energy if they're working out in a fasted state first thing in the morning. So it's often helpful for them to have some sort of meal or shake or smoothie, just something little to get their energy up. And yeah, those would be some of the differences. Now, I think just from a mechanical, like physical level, men have more muscle too, typically. So muscle is that storage vessel for the glycogen that's available. So we have to think about that as well, that men will just typically do well on a whole with being in that fasted state. Yeah.
That makes sense. Yeah. Thank you for that clarification.
You're welcome.
So you alluded to maybe someone who's ill, has a chronic disease, they might want to fast a little bit more. the sicker you are, it might be more beneficial. So that made me think of autophagy, which is a buzzword, all over social media, the internet. So is it real? Is there a certain amount of time that we need to fast in order for it to take effect? And also, what is it, maybe to begin with, for those listeners that might not be familiar with it?
Yeah. So the word auto means self, phagy means to digest. So autophagy is getting rid of old cells and helping with cell rejuvenation. All of us are going to go through some sort of level of autophagy basically all the time. It's going to be elevated at night when we're in the fasted state, and it's really important that we do that. There's always going to be this flip-flop of building up and breaking down, building up and breaking down. And there's ways to capitalize on both of those phases. So when we're in a fed state, we activate something called mTOR, and we suppress something called AMPK. And these are signaling molecules that mTOR helps to signal muscle protein synthesis and kind of shuts off autophagy. And then vice versa, when we're in a fasted state, we suppress mTOR and we activate AMPK. And that helps to kind of speed up or stimulate autophagy. So this flip-flop is really important. What happens is when people don't really get into the fasted state for long enough, maybe they're snacking after dinner and then waking up and having their coffee and muffin or whatever it is, they don't really capitalize on that fasted state and maximize that rejuvenation effect. And then they wake up, and I'm just going to give not such a great example in terms of what people eat, but I'd say it's most people. You wake up, you have your coffee and muffin. And if you're having your coffee and muffin or coffee or cereal or toast or whatever is high carb, and you're not getting at least 20 to 30 grams of protein, then you're not having a robust effect on the fed state, and you're not even activating mTOR and those mechanisms properly and in a really strong way. So it's kind of about, when you're in the fasted state, trying to maximize that. But then when you're in the fed state, really trying to take advantage, using protein mostly, we can talk about that if you want, to stimulate the growth and rejuvenation process through that state. And then when you're embarking on longer fasts, 24-hour fasts, 3 to 5 day fasts, maybe even longer sometimes, you're kind of giving your body a bit of a cleanup, like a more aggressive cleanup shop type thing. And when you're done those fasts, you're just going back to your regular diet and regular life. So you're building back up. When they do autopsies in some of those fasting studies where they use the fasting mimicking diet, the organs will shrink by 40% during that 5-day fast. And then when they go into refeeding, they'll come right back to where they were. The only two organs that don't shrink during those 5 days is the brain and the testicles.
That's so fascinating.
Isn't it? And I guess those are the two most important things in order to keep this human race rolling. But yeah, so it all comes back. So there's definitely this flip-flop of breaking stuff down. And we don't want to do that too long. As we know with the contestants in Alone, if you do it too long, they're losing too much muscle, and it could actually lead to organ failure. So we want to really just capitalize on that flip-flop.
So I just want to make sure I'm understanding and that I'm clear. You can fast long enough to get to ketosis, and that brings its own types of benefits. However, if we don't get into ketosis and we're doing more of a longer overnight fast, we still can get the benefits of autophagy and some of these other cleanup mechanisms. They're just a little different than what you get in a full ketosis state. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
It's like a graduated system almost, as you move through a longer and longer time, you start to tap into other mechanisms. So you're exactly right that when we're doing an overnight fast, we're not 99.9% of the population will not get into ketosis by the time they wake up. If someone is keto adapted and they've been practicing this for a while and have really reduced the carbs quite a bit for a long time and have played around with ketosis, it is possible that they are in ketosis when they wake up in the morning.
Okay. We hear a lot about ketosis, but could you clarify, because I think there's confusion generally between ketosis and ketoacidosis. Can you just clarify those two terms?
Yes. So nutritional ketosis is a state where we're making ketones from fat. And if you measure that in the blood, the millimoles will be about 0.5 to maybe 2. Ketoacidosis is basically a medical emergency. And it's when the ketones get so high, this can happen in a type 1 diabetic, for example, where they can't make insulin to get sugar into their cells. And therefore, the body is just trying to convert fat into ketones at such a high level that the ketones just skyrocket. And that becomes, the magnitude of that is way higher than nutritional ketosis, and that becomes a very dangerous situation. The average person who does not have diabetes, it's almost impossible to get to that point. So they don't have to worry.
What about type 2 diabetes versus type 1? Is that a risk with fasting for type 2 diabetes?
I'm not sure, actually,
Okay.
if type 2 diabetics can get ketoacidosis. I suppose if they were far enough along and they couldn't get the sugar into the cells, they'd have high insulin. Yeah, I'm not sure if it's as common with type 2 diabetics.
But it's not something we commonly see with using fasting as a strategy with general population and type 2 diabetes. It's not something that is...
Correct. I would say it's almost impossible to get into a state of ketoacidosis. And of course, from like the medical perspective, they learned about ketoacidosis and they get scared of ketones and ketogenic and all that. So there's a lot of stigma around that and misconception from a medical perspective.
Yeah. So on a little bit of a lighter note, I have a question that I get asked a lot is what technically breaks a fast? So true story, I had a client that asked me if brushing her teeth was breaking the fast. I was like, well, you're eating your toothpaste? I don't know how many calories toothpaste has, but anyway, what do you consider breaking a fast to be?
Okay. So brushing your teeth will not break a fast, just for the record. If she's
That's
listening.
what I said. Good. I'm glad the expert agrees.
And basically, there has to be calories, firstly. So that's a good starting point. So something like tea, coffee is not going to break the fast unless there's sugar in it. But just straight up, anything non-caloric is not going to break a fast. In fact, some of the polyphenols in green tea and coffee have been shown to help some of those processes like autophagy, like you were talking about. It actually helps to maximize that and make the effect even better. There's other polyphenols like we find in pomegranate and different dark fruits and vegetables that can actually help that process if you're taking them in supplement form. So the two things we need to be aware of for breaking a fast are basically carbohydrates and protein. If you consume too much of either of those, or even just a little bit, you can come out of ketosis and sort of break the effects of the fast. Specifically, when it comes to protein, the main signaler is leucine, which is an amino acid. When we're in the fed state, we actually want to capitalize on that and maximize the amount of leucine we're consuming. We need about 2.5 grams per meal to have a robust mTOR activation and muscle protein synthesis. If you're eating animal proteins, that's pretty easy to get to. If you're eating plant proteins, it's a little bit more difficult, and sometimes it needs to be supplemented. But with carbohydrates, as soon as you're hitting 20 grams, 10, 20 grams, then you can start to come out of that fasted state pretty quickly. The other thing with protein that people need to be aware of, and this is a trap that I fell into when I was testing the ketogenic diet on myself, is if you're taking out the carbohydrates and you're eating more in the protein and fat, Sometimes you don't increase the fat enough, but you increase the protein quite a bit. And when there's quite a bit of protein consumed, your body can go through a process called gluconeogenesis, and it can take some of that protein and convert it into glucose, and that'll take you out of ketosis if you're in ketosis. I mean, it would take you out of the fasted state anyway if you're eating that. But if your goal is ketosis, that high amount of protein could convert into sugar and cause insulin release and take you out of ketosis. So that was something I experienced, where I was still eating quite a bit of protein. Like I think I had a couple cans of sardines or it was mackerel and some vegetables, and it was too much protein, not enough fat. So at another meal, I had a ribeye, which is really high in fat, as a cut of steak with some green leafies, and I went into ketosis, no problem that time. So it's a bit of adjustment. And I also suggest that if people really want to try this full on, they should test their blood as they're doing it. There's a great monitor, can I mention it? Mm-hmm. Yeah, called the Keto Mojo. That's what I use. It comes with little test strips, and that way you can test both your glucose and your ketones. There's also a ratio you want to look for, which the machine tells you all that information, so it makes it super easy. And you can test instead of guess, which is always a really important thing to do if you're trying to do this full on.
I know a lot of people use like the urine test strips for ketones. What do you think about that?
Not as accurate as blood, because there's two ketones that are predominantly produced. There's beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate. Mm-hmm. And usually urine strips will test, I think it's beta-hydroxybutyrate, but that only gets released at the beginning of the ketogenic diet. So there could be some, it's not the best way. Blood is definitely the number one way. There's also breathalyzer type things that you could use, mm-hmm. which I think measures acetone from acetoacetate. So you're not really getting the full picture, whereas the blood is probably the gold standard right now for that. The Keto Mojo, you got to prick your skin every time you want to measure, but they're actually coming out with continuous ketone monitors. There's a company in Europe that makes one. You can't get it in Canada yet, or in the US. I don't think they ship the product yet, but it's like a continuous glucose monitor, but it's continuous ketone monitor. It just goes right on the back of your arm. You wear it for 2 weeks, and it tells you your real-time production of ketones. So I think we'll get more and more of those coming out, and they'll be available to everyone.
Pretty soon we're going to be walking around with things hanging all over.
Yeah, glucose on one arm, ketone on the other, Oura Ring, Fitbit.
Yeah, we'll know who the biohackers are, right? With all the devices.
That's right. That's
great. Well, we could keep going for another hour, but we're going to have to leave it there for today. Hopefully you'll come back. We can't thank you enough, Josh, for sharing your knowledge and perspective with us today. We really appreciate. You're an excellent communicator. And
thank you. It was my pleasure. Really enjoyed it.
Good. We did too. And thanks to all of our listeners. We always appreciate you spending part of your day with us and you being here. Please take a minute to leave us a review or a like, depending on which platform you use, and share this with a friend or a family member, loved one, to help us spread the health. So until next time, take care, everyone.
To learn more, go to maxgenlabs.com. Don't miss a beat. Find other episodes and subscribe to this podcast on YouTube or check us out on your favorite streaming app. Now available on Apple Podcasts, Pandora, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and more. You can also visit nanp.org for more information. Looking for a board-certified holistic nutrition professional to support you on your health journey? Go to nanp.org to get started today. Membership in the NANP provides you with a competitive advantage. Whether you're a current practitioner or a student, we want you to become an active, informed leader of the holistic nutrition community and join our association today. When you're ready to go a step further, you can boost your credibility by becoming board certified in holistic nutrition. Visit nanp.org today to apply. The information on the NANP podcast is for educational purposes only and should not be considered medical or legal advice. The NANP is not liable or responsible for any harm, damage, or illness arising from the use of the information contained herein. By listening to the information on this podcast, you agree to defend, indemnify, and hold harmless the NANP and all agents. Copyright NANP, all rights reserved. Until next time, stay nourished.